Good morning, my name is Rick Fletcher, and I'm with Nufarm Americas, and what I get to do is product development work. So if there's a question that the field guys ask, or you ask to one of our field guys, that question comes back to me in the sense of, can we do this, how can we do this, etc. So I've had the privilege of doing that for many numbers of years. Today we're going to talk about fall crops, and we're going to cover some of the diseases of some of the fall crops. So we're going to highlight a few because, as you can imagine, 30 minutes, it's hard to get a lot of material covered. So what I've got up here is just a tidbit about starting clean and finishing strong, finishing clean, talking about the roles of scouting to get you started. And then you can see here, focusing on several diseases, thinking of a foliar aspect, looking at bacterial diseases, botrytis and powdery mildew, and of course you'll see a lot of poinsettia relationships here, and then going into the root and crown rot diseases. So we'll be focusing mostly on Pythium and Rhizoctonia. Finally, my last little quip about applying it right, and then if there's any time for questions and answers, we'll do those. So Nufarm, very briefly, over 100 years old, broad portfolio of materials, carrying a whole host of fungicides, insecticides, herbicides, growth regulators, etc. And what you're looking at with Nufarm here in the U.S. is a slow accumulation, both in development of new materials as well as acquisition, where we've had Nufarm-based products, Cleary-based products, and Sumitomo Valent-based products all coming together under one umbrella. So you probably have seen some of these brands that we've got. We'll talk about a few of these today as they fit into certain of the diseases that we're going to cover. And I have fun and put this fella up. Anybody remember him? So the Lone Ranger, right? So he was known for saying "Hi-O Silver," right? And he was known for leaving a silver bullet. So who in the audience wants a silver bullet for your problem today, right? We're all going to leave with one? Okay, good. So we've been very active in what we've been doing the last 4 or 5 years, and a lot of this has been pipelines being able to come to fruition, and there's still more things coming in the line, but you can see a variety of herbicide products, miticide products, fungicide products that we've been able to bring to market recently. By now you're bored? You know how long it took me to get that dog in that chair? Okay. So I start off with this. So this is a picture I took up in Ontario. So this is June in Ontario. So they had just finished up a crop, and this is what the place looked like. And you can imagine that some of you have probably gone through this transition and been forced to clean this up, right? Because you can't start this way. You guys all know that starting this way is going to be a disaster, and you need to be doing something along these lines as far as making sure you've got the debris out of it. And I like to suggest this. In this case here, this fella is doing a disinfectant using a Q-salt or a strip-it or something like that as far as the material. And I'd like to stress to you, why do you think it's important to be doing something like this? I want you to think of some of the diseases that we're going to be talking about. Things like Rhizoctonia, for example. Things like Phalaeviopsis, for example. These are sporulating diseases, and those spores float in the air. And those air currents carry things to window ledges. So if you don't clean the house, you end up with the potential for inoculum. How do you know if you're going to have a potential for inoculum? What happened last season? What did you just survive? So if you just survived a bad Rhizoc outbreak, if you just survived a bad Botrytis outbreak, if you just survived a bad thrips outbreak, these are all some of these things that you'd want to get going through in your head as far as, how am I going to start? Get the inoculum out of the house, and that's my point there. So I like to tell people, just rule of thumb, you're all in your own schedules, but a month out, you know what you've got planned. You know what's getting ready to come, so a month out, you should be in there making sure everything's clean, you're ready to go, you have an idea where you're going to lay your floor plans, where your plants are going to go, etc. So you've got that all ready. Cleaning under the benches. Why do we want to clean under benches if we don't have flood floors or solid concrete? What often happens under a bench? Organic matter, plant debris, which then gets wet, which then forms algae, which then brings us shore flies, right? So all of these things link together as far as starting clean. Are your house in order as far as your propagation space, your weeds cleaned up? Look at your application equipment, especially since we're going into poinsettias. Of course, poinsettias are always, typically mist started. Have you looked at that equipment? Has that thing been calibrated? Is it, as far as delivering the water that you want it to deliver? Is it cleaned and not clogged so that you can get good application? And then the one part that always becomes an issue with many folks is, do you know your water quality? And that's key, because the water quality, of course, you're putting it on top of your plant, you're putting it into the soil media of your plant, and you're mixing your chemicals with it. And we could go down a whole host of tank mixing issues and other things, which a lot of times relate to the water quality that you start with. So anybody, you can see the top left. Anybody got a drone yet that they're flying through their house? So this is from Europe. So the guys are actually flying drones in the houses. Of course, they better be 23 footers, because if not, they're going to be having some issues. But they actually fly, after they get things set up, they actually fly overhead. And what are they looking for? Tell me some diseases that would form what I'll call hand grenade circles. Where the disease starts in an epicenter and starts to go out. Can you think of Pythium? Can you think of Rhizoc? So they're flying overhead looking for these symptomatic, because when they're all spaced on the floor, they can't take a glance all the way over and see things. So now they're actually starting to look overhead. Some of the European materials now are actually starting to use some of the crop technology, and they're doing scans where they can look at plant chlorophyll levels as they're flying over these things. It's getting really crazy. But my point is, you've got to look for stuff. When do you start looking for things? How do you look for things? So everybody knows that the standard set of tools that you're supposed to have, right? You're supposed to have a notebook, you're supposed to have a hand lens. If you're doing insects, you're going to have sticky cards, you're going to have clothespins, you're going to have markers to mark off the areas so that you know, I inspected this today, I need to go back here and inspect it tomorrow so that you're in the same spot. And of course, some maps of your houses so you can start locating your spots. Because if you're starting, your scouts are finding hits, they need to go back to those areas and make sure those areas are growing, how they're progressing, how big they're getting, how fast they're going. So I always have fun with this one, is that the best thing you can do is early detection. So what's the best early detection you can do? When you buy your plugs, when you buy your seed, how about that for your first step? So how do you know if your seed is coming in without a bacterial pathogen on the outside of it? You don't. Unless you test it, you don't. How do you know your cuttings aren't coming in having been shipped in a box and they're all dry and kind of soggy and now they've got bacteria in them? How do you know they don't have bacteria in them? Well, I just described the symptomology. So if you get a case in and you open that box of cuttings and it looks like soggy stuff, your next thing should be on the phone to your supplier saying, this is a box of soggy stuff, I don't want it, right? That's where you have to start. I can tell you, as we talk about bacteria, you will not catch up to bacteria. Once you have bacteria and it starts to go, you can't really save that. You will fight that so much that you won't be happy with either the expenditure you make or the output at the end. So you're better off nipping that one in the bud. Yes, that is an electrical device between two flip-flops. So if you ever want these just for fun, it's DarwinAwards.com. And it is picture after picture of people trying to take themselves out of the gene pool, literally. But I always do this because myself and Nancy's in the audience, we do a lot of technical stuff. We use that technical stuff to write labels. I have yet to write an idiot-proof label. And I'm not being mean. And we've written a lot of idiot-resistant labels, but we can't write one that people just say, well, what if I do this? Okay. Okay, so we're off to poinsettias, or at least starting some fall diseases. So this is probably, anybody in this stage already? Right? Anybody got some long day ones that are going? So we're starting this stage. We've got our cuttings. We've got them into the packs. We've run our misters, and we're in this stage. So what can show up? Well, I talked about this one already. Probably the ones that you want to look for first when those cuttings come into you in the box is going to be something like a bacteria. So there's several different bacteria that we have to fight with, and you have to look for what they're doing, because certain of them will key into certain plants. They'll do all sorts of things for you. They'll do vascular wilts. They'll do leaf blots. They'll do spots. They'll do cankers. There's a whole host of things that go on with bacterial diseases as they start to express themselves. And you look at some of these symptomologies, and in the picture to the right, you might think maybe that's a downy mildew too. So you've got to go and look at that very closely and get it sampled and figure out what's going on. And of course, the old adage of sometimes if it's bad enough as a vascular bacterial, you can literally pull it apart and see streaming. Now, if you've seen streaming, you just take the crop out to the dumpster and forget it, because you're done, you're toast. So we have a lot of different plants that get affected by bacteria, but we're dealing with three main groups of bacteria: the Erwinias, the Pseudomonas, and the Xanthomonas. And of course, this is just a rough list of the common plants that they like to attack. Yes, there are ones that cross over and do more than one plant, but just as a fast down and dirty, if you're growing some of these plants, you think you have bacteria, these would probably be the first targets I would tell you to look for. So it's always critical to start off clean, and I talked about this, getting clean material when you start. If you've got a bacterial situation, I want you to think about that misting. Remember, most bacteria are spread two ways, or three ways. They're spread by man activity as far as cutting or moving plants, brushing against that bacteria that's on the outside, and then they're also spread by splashing. So depending on what you're doing with your misting system, if you've got a lot of heavy mist, you can see literally the infections running from one part of the plant, running down the sides of the plant, running from this plant, touching the next plant as the water is moving from the plants. So you do want to be aware of that. And one of the things you can do from that is just make sure you're not overwatering. Look at what you're doing with your misters to make sure you don't have a lot of free water. Anybody using any wetting agents with their misters? Think about that one. What does a spreading wetting agent do for this water if I'm using a mister? Spreads it out flat, right? So now I don't have these big beads. I don't have these beads that are accumulating bacteria and then running down the plant to the next plant. So there's little tricks that you can do just to kind of help your management. What do we have here? Wash tools, clean your equipment, and then the last one. When in doubt, if you think you've got something cooking, the only way to really know is test it. So there are some labs around the country that you can get this stuff tested, and they'll go ahead and run it for you. So some quick examples, just a picture is a cyclamen with some Erwinia. That might be a common situation. Talking about poinsettias, a Paclobacteria with poinsettias starting to rot right down there in the bottom. And you can see to the right how it will actually affect right where that sticking point is. It'll get down there in that infection and hit that sticking point. And then, of course, it can move up to the leaf. This is a picture of a Pseudomonas on a leaf, causing a canker and an infection on the leaf surface. And a lot of these things, you talk about doing cultural control. Now we're going to move into doing some chemical control. And, of course, when you look at the history of chemical control, most of our chemical controls were limited to a handful of materials up until, and I'll say recent times. And when I say recent times, many of you may collaborate with the IR4. Anybody? What? It went too fast? Okay. So we have the IR4. If any of you have ever collaborated with the IR4 group is a group for you. So if you have not collaborated with the IR4 group, first I challenge you to get to know who they are. Second, I challenge you to get to use them, because what they're there for is your questions on, I struggle every year with this. Is there a remedy for this? Well, the IR4 is part of the USDA, which does the research around the US at land-grant colleges to get those questions answered for you. You have the ability to simply fill out a form and request that something be researched. One of the most recent, if you would, successes with the IR4 was, if you've noticed a lot of labels recently having herbs and spices added to them, That's probably one of the bigger things that's been going on, is trying to get the codexes and get everything aligned there. But otherwise, IR4 has been doing a lot of work, and several years ago, they did a complete wall-to-wall study, if you would, of bacteria. And they came up with lists like this. So I've just summarized a whole, this is about a 90-page report. So if you see something on here that you're interested in, go and look for it. But it's available online. If you go to IR4 Horticulture, it's available online in the report. The reports are updated every year regarding the materials as new data gets added to them. They're a wealth of knowledge for you just at your fingertips. But you get stuff like this as far as some positives and some, some that we thought might work and just didn't, and that's the point of doing the research. As far as some, historical materials, with the bacteria, you constantly see a pattern where things like copper, things like mancozeb, things like antibiotics have historically had a place, and those still do have a place, except we have the R word. Anybody know what the R word is? It's resistance. Okay, so we do have resistance out there from folks that have used copper, or antibiotic over and over again. You can have forms of bacteria which are not going to react in full strength to the treatment. So you have to be aware of that. But there are very good indications of products that have worked historically well. What you're looking at here is big bars are good. So there's another study done by Dave Norman, another big bars are good. So this material's out there in the rain where you can find it. How we doing? All right. So we move over. What do we got going on here? Hopefully none of you see this. So this is the fun part, right? So you're looking at this plant, you're starting to see it wilt. So what goes through your head? Oh, I didn't water it enough. Oh, I over-fertilized it. And then, of course, you do that, and you go, oh, there's no roots. No wonder the top's wilting. All right, so have you answered the question, why aren't there any roots? Okay, so now you have to go and be the detective. Why aren't there ample white roots here? And that's why we're seeing that topical expression of the disease. And of course, this happens to be Pythium. So it can be Pythium, it can be Rhizoc, it doesn't matter. Anything that causes the root to be dysfunctional and not suck up the water it's supposed to, then the plant can't meet its evapotranspiration demand, and it wilts. Straightforward. So you want to look for these things and start pulling this out. Now the key thing about Pythiums, and you've all seen this, we call these soft rots, where they get into root areas, they'll get into crown areas, and they cause this soft decomposition. There was always the old wives' tale of, oh, I know I have Pythium, I'll grab the root and pull it, and all the stuff on the outside will come off and the cortex will stay in the middle. All that tells you is you had a dead root. You haven't determined why the root's dead yet, but you have a dead root. So you have to be aware of those things. Use those as symptomologies for you. Pythiums can attack below ground as well as above ground. We have foliar Pythiums. We have stem-based, crown-based Pythiums, as well as soil-based Pythiums. And the theme here is, again, we talked about bacteria, water splashing. So again, Pythium is going to be another one of these water splashers. So Pythium in its mobile form is an oospore, which is this little swimming thing with a tail, and it likes free water. So if you've got wet media, if you've got splashing, this critter can go from one plant to the next or one area from the next, and you can get the spread that way. So the first appearances, commonly, you don't see that wilt until later on, but some of the first things might be as you're looking at your plugs, checking the viability of their stick, you might see some soft rot down there at the bottom. And that's just an indicator of I need to look closer at what this is, because the key thing about this, at this stage, at that cutting stage, you could have a Rhizoctonia, you could have a bacteria, or you could have a Pythium. You could have all three going on. So you have to be very aware of what's there. And I stress this as far as, at this point, unless you've got a microscope and understand anything about pathology, you should take that and send that sample off to somebody that can tell you what you've got. The reason for that is, does a Pythium chemical work on Rhizoctonia? Not all the time. Does a bacteria product work on Pythium? Not all the time. So my point is, if you don't know for sure, you could pull a chemical out of your shelf, put it into a tank, spray it, and 3 days later you're still scratching your head and you've just spent money and nothing's changed. So that's my point there, is just make sure you know what it is, because a lot of chemicals don't cross back and forth between bacteria, Rhizoctonia, and Pythium. All right, what else to tell you? Water capacity, look at your water. Biologicals, we do have several biologicals that can be introduced into the beginning of the crop, if you would. Things like root shield and mycostop and things. So these are going to be competing forms of fungi, which are going to set up barriers or on the leaf. They're going to form that symbiotic bond with that root, and they're going to minimize the ability of the Pythium to attack the root, because it's got to go through the fungus first. There's a whole bunch of different mechanisms at work, some by barrier, some by chemical admission, but it's a great early warning tool. It's good for low pathogen levels, maybe moderate pathogen levels. If you get to high levels, these things often don't catch up, but it's a great early tool. So if you look at some fungicides that are out there, I just put these in by active ingredient because there's a million brands that are out there, but the old standbys as far as metalaxyl and mefenoxam, things like mixtures of azoxystrobin or paraclostrobin, is things like propamacarb, hydrochlorate, phenamidone, etradiazole, phos acids, numerous materials that are out there that all have various abilities of movement or work either as a contact or as a systemic activity on Pythium. Moving on. 8 minutes. Anybody see this? So this is rhizoc. So this is the beginning of some rhizoc coming down there and nibbling at the stems. And the interesting thing is, if you look on the picture to the right, you can actually see the webbing. You actually see the mycelial strands of the rhizoc coming up out of the cube and grabbing into that infection point. So this can happen, and of course you don't want to get to that point where the whole cube tray starts to quit on you. So what's the interesting thing about rhizoc, since my theme has been water? Rhizoc can also move with the water. So if you've got a really wet cube, you can literally watch this guy dance down the cube. So that can move. So this tends to be the misting disease. So July and August, you start getting into September, you start getting into October, and you're starting to get cooler. You're starting to run out of the typical temperatures that rhizoc likes to operate in. So it starts to get a little less conducive for this disease to go crazy. However, when you're early sticking, July and August, and it's hot in the house, it's perfect conditions for Rhizoctonia to go crazy. So that's when you really want to watch it. Remember I talked about cleaning off the benches and cleaning off the shelves. So Rhizoctonia is a spore producer. It likes to live in soil and in dust. It'll sit on ledges. So if you had a historical rhizoc event, you want to make sure you clean that off, because that's a good thing to do. Sanitation is key with rhizoc. What else here? So you get to see this tan lesion. Sometimes you get a border with it. Leaf infections can be contact. They can be moving along the soil surface. If we talk about some products that could work for the stem rot, you're looking at things like thiophanate methyl, tried and true. You're looking at things like triflumazole or tebuconazole as far as the group 3 materials. You're looking at the group 11s, the strobilurins, the azoxystrobin, paraclostrobin, trifloxystrobin. Good old PCNB. I bet most of you are scared to death of PCNB. You shouldn't be. If you've got southern blight, it might save your rear end someday. Iprodione, flutalonil, and fludeoxonil, things like Emblem or Medallion, are great materials that have all tried and true. We know a lot of history with this on rhizocs. Moving over to Botrytis. Anybody get to see these nasty pictures? Hopefully you don't. One of the neat things I'll tell you about Botrytis is Botrytis, and the next one up with powdery mildew. One of the easiest things you can do to control Botrytis and powdery mildew is to be vigilant of your relative humidities at night. And I can't say that any simpler. If you can simply go through a vent and heat cycle and drop your relative humidities under 85%, get it down to 80, it doesn't have to be a lot under 85. But just to get it under that, the disease severity you'll get out of those two diseases drops radically. So it's one of those little things. But you can see here in some of these pictures, the rhizoc in full sporulation there on the left, how it's starting to nibble at the leaf there, and you're starting to see the gray spore masses, the quote gray mold that we constantly see. And then of course it goes all the way down. Here's a stem picture on the right where it's attacked the stem and caused the plant to wilt down. You can also see pictures like this where it's taken out larger plants and just goes right down into the stem. That stem causes a girdling, the top quits off. So you tend to see this in propagation. If you got enough light, you typically won't see it, or it'll be less, because it likes to be cool, damp. It likes those high relative humidity, so a lot of light tends to dry off that air a little bit. So those tend to be some of the like side circumstances of this. And then there's some issues when you get into bracking, whether or not it's really botrytis attacking the brack or if it's something else. And of course, you've all known about calcium diseases or calcium deficiency relationships. And I popped these two pictures up. And of course, I put the headings underneath of them. But this is one picture on the left showing some botrytis starting to nibble at a brack. And there's a picture on the right with actual calcium deficiency symptomology. So if you're looking quickly, you might miss this one. So you have to look at what do you really have. And of course, we've got a lot of historic data on botrytis management. This is an old slide from Mary Hausbeck back in 2003. And in this case, little bars are good. So again, where can you find this information? IR4 has a historic reference to all of this information. This is about a 120-page report, and it's got the historical research that's been done over time. It's all there for you to go see. And of course, some of the more recent stuff, just looking at things that work. This is Spectro, this is chlorothalonil and thiophanate methyl. So you've got a contact and a systemic. This is a firm or polyoxin, and there's a whole host of other ones. So you get into some of the more recent things that have been tested. This was a big study done by Mary Hausbeck. This is an eye chart. This is in the IR4 report. I'm going to skip through this because I am down to 3 minutes. But it shows that you do have a lot of materials. I've highlighted two. That NUP 09092 is a fludioxonil compound. So again, if it's a medallion, if it's an emblem, the fludioxonil does have a great effect on this disease. So then I bring this one up because this is always fun. I can't tell you how many times us in the tech world get that question, is it safe to spray on bracts? Okay, I'll be the first one to tell you, nothing's safe to spray on bracts. There are things that are less risks to spray on bracts, but there's nothing that's, quote, safe. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of chemistry, a lot of testing that goes into these materials. I've given you some pictures here of some stuff that we did up at a trial where we actually did it in brack, and you're looking for two things. We're looking for residues. In other words, does the chemical leave a residue that makes the product unsaleable, which is a big concern for you guys. And then number two, did it cause any phytotoxicity? Did it cause any stunting? Did it cause any leaf drop, etc.? So if you see products and their labels say that this thing is labeled for bracking, then I can tell you that a lot of this research has been done, and there's a high level of safety that we think can go into that. You bored? That's my cat. So last, I'm going to finish up here is in the speed dating. You've all seen this, right? Hopefully you haven't seen a lot of it, because if you see it on that color, the white on the red, you know you're in trouble, because you're at the end, you're trying to sell this puppy, and all of a sudden this thing's showing up with powdery mildew on there. And of course it can get worse. It can spread out on the lower leaves, et cetera, and be all over the place. And of course we always recognize it as those white spots that are very easy to see. We have to take a look both on the top leaves and on the underside of the leaves. Don't forget the underside of the leaves, just like a rust. It could start on the underside before it shows up on the top. So you have to be aware of that. And many mild cases can go unnoticed for a long time and then just explode on you, so you have to be aware of that. A whole host of things cause powdery mildew. You'll notice the blue one that I've got highlighted, the oidium. So that's the one that's on poinsettia. So that's the one we worry about here. They tend to be very highly specialized in what they do. And of course, they leave that distinctive whitish mark as far as its reproductive areas that it's trying to send out for new spores and grow. So this is a very fast grower. The spores can live a while. They can germinate just about anywhere. They have some regimes as far as temperature. They have some regimes as far as humidity. But you can see this process is as little as 3 days and as long as 7 days for an infection. If you're looking for some materials, again, pull up the IR4 work. There's a whole host of materials, but a short list here, just looking at things like triflumazole or trifloxystrobin, paraclostrobin, or combinations of thiophanate, methyl, and mancozeb, all have great track records of working on powdery mildew. Scared? Right? Please tell me none of you apply chemicals like this. So I was in his house, and this guy says, I'm going to make an application. I said, okay. And he comes out, and he's all dressed up, and he starts to spray like that. I said, what are you spraying for? So what do you think he's spraying for? He was spraying for thrips. So that's funny, right? How many of you have ever seen thrips on poinsettia? Yeah, it tends not to like them. But he's spraying for thrips. Okay, so where do thrips live? Like, they like to live in the flowers, but they also like to live on the stems under the flowers. So how the heck is that application going to get anything wet under the leaf? And that's always my point to you guys. When you're talking about directed sprays or systemic materials, make sure you get the chemical in the right location. Understand if it moves or it doesn't move. Where's the disease? Where's the bug? Where's my spray? So I always kid people about that. Lastly, if you get to stop by our booth, because I've got to finish up, we've got some handy-dandy online guides that take you through a whole program, et cetera, et cetera. I am not a fan of programs. Rick Fletcher isn't, because when I write these programs, I write them in my little cubicle. I'm not in your greenhouse. I don't know what your agronomic conditions are. So I tell you to use these programs as a guide. If you're going along and you are X in your crop cycle and you've got Y disease, maybe you can look at this and go, oh, maybe these are the things I need to look for or look at. So we have one on poinsettia, we have one on mums. And with that, any quick questions?